The hospital boardroom on the 14th floor had a view of the city that most people would have called beautiful. Floor-to-soiling windows, the kind that made everything below look small and manageable. But when Ronan Hale walked in that Tuesday morning and saw the 7 members of the Whitcomb Medical Group already seated, already still, already watching him, the way hawks watched something they'd already decided to take, the view meant nothing at all. He was 38 years old, a trauma surgeon, a man who had spent the last 6 years rebuilding a pediatric emergency protocol from scratch in a hospital that everyone else had written off. And now, sitting at the center of that long mahogany table like something placed there for them to evaluate, was a document, thick, bound in a folder so clean it looked like it had never been touched by human hands, and printed on the cover in precise corporate lettering, acquisition terms, Whitcomb Medical Group and Hale Surgical Institute. The lead attorney didn't look up when he spoke. He simply slid the folder forward with 2 fingers the way someone might push a receipt across a counter. $420 million, Dr. Hale. Full asset transfer. Complete operational authority surrendered within 90 days. The number landed in the room the way those numbers always did, like something that was supposed to make every other thought irrelevant. Ronan turned the first page, then the second, then the third, and somewhere around the 4th, the air in the room changed in a way only he could feel, because buried beneath the language about integration timelines and restructuring phases was what this actually was. They weren't acquiring his work. They were dismantling it, rebranding it, folding it into a system that would answer to their board, serve their margins, and carry his name only as long as it was useful for marketing. And before he could finish reading, the man at the head of the table spoke. His name was Gerald Whitcomb III, 64 years old. Silver hair, a tie that cost more than most people's rent, and the particular kind of confidence that only existed in men who had never once been told that their instincts were wrong. "You've accomplished something real," Gerald said, his voice carrying that tone. The one that was technically a compliment but felt like a hand on your shoulder that was meant to push you down. Genuinely impressive, for an independent operation of your size. He paused just long enough to let the qualifier land. "But let's be clear-eyed about what you've built, Ronan. It's fragile. One funding gap, one regulatory review, one bad quarter, and everything you've protected collapses. Men like you are exceptional at the beginning. The vision, the sacrifice. But scaling sustainably? That requires infrastructure most solo founders simply don't have." A few heads nodded around the table, not aggressively, just enough. And then the woman to Gerald's left, Catherine Whitcomb, his daughter, the group's chief strategy officer, looked at Ronan with an expression that wasn't quite pity and wasn't quite contempt, but lived somewhere between the two. "The protocol you developed is genuinely promising," she said. "We'd be foolish not to want it, but the liability of keeping you in operational control at this scale would be difficult to justify to our stakeholders." And that was when the humiliation arrived. Not loud, not theatrical. Just that particular coldness of being spoken about in the third person while you were sitting right there, of being assessed like an asset rather than a human being, of realizing that none of the people in this room had ever actually considered the possibility that he might say no. Ronan's hand moved without thinking. He reached into the front pocket of his jacket, just slightly, just enough to feel the edge of his phone, and the screen lit up for a second in his palm, and he saw it, the photo he'd set as his lock screen 6 months ago without really knowing why. His son's, Owen, 9 years old, sitting on the back porch in the early morning before school, holding a mug of hot chocolate with both hands, steam rising, squinting into the light, and smiling in that sideways way that looked so much like his mother, it still sometimes caught Ronan off guard. Owen, who woke up every morning and made his own breakfast because he knew his dad was usually already on a call by 6 a.m. Owen, who had learned to fold laundry at age 7 not because anyone made him, but because he could see his father was tired. Owen, who once sat quietly in the corner of Ronan's office for 4 hours with a book and a granola bar because the sitter canceled and there was no other option, and who, when Ronan finally looked up and apologized, had just shrugged and said, "I'm good, Dad. I know it matters." Something in Ronan's chest went very quiet and then very certain. He looked back up at Gerald Whitcomb, at the folder on the table, at the room full of people who had structured an entire acquisition around the assumption that he would be grateful. And slowly, without drama, he closed the document. The sound of it in that quiet room was sharper than it had any right to be. "Thank you for the offer," Ronan said. His voice was even. Not cold, not brittle, just steady in a way that seemed to confuse a few of them. "But what you're describing isn't an acquisition. It's a dissolution, and I didn't spend 6 years building something for the people it serves just to hand it to a board of directors who'll optimize it for margin." Gerald's expression didn't crack. It just tightened slightly, the way expensive things do when they're under unexpected pressure. "You're making a decision based on emotion," he said, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. "No," Ronan replied. "I'm making a decision based on what I actually built and what it actually does." He stood, buttoned his jacket. "You'll want to send the paperwork through proper channels if anything changes on your end." He walked out of the 14th floor, with his heart beating harder than it did in surgery, which was saying something. And in the elevator, watching his own reflection in the polished steel doors, he didn't feel triumphant. He felt the weight of what he'd just done pressing down on him like the opening act of something he couldn't fully see yet. Because $420 million wasn't just a number. It was security. It was his son's college tuition and then some. It was the version of the future where Ronan never had to worry again. And he had just handed it back across the table without asking anyone's permission. Outside, the city moved the way cities do. Indifferent, enormous, already moving on to the next thing. Ronan stood on the sidewalk for a moment, phone in hand, before a text came through from Owen's school. "Reminder, science fair project due Thursday. Owen mentioned you were going to help him this week." He stared at the screen. Then he put the phone in his pocket and walked to his car. When he got home that evening, the apartment smelled like something had been burned and then aggressively ventilated, and Owen was standing at the stove with a dish towel over his shoulder, and an expression of tremendous dignity despite the faint smoke haze around him. "I tried to make pasta," Owen said. "I can see that the water got away from me." Ronan set his bag down and came to stand beside him, looking at the pot. "We can fix this." "Yeah," Owen handed him the spoon. Then he studied his father's face the way he always did, with that particular focused attention that made Ronan feel like he was being read by someone who was much older than 9. "Bad day? Long day? Different?" Ronan glanced at him. "What?" "You look different when it's a long day versus when it's a bad day," Owen said. "Your shoulders are up for bad. They're just forward for long." Ronan thought about that. He turned back to the stove. "I made a big decision today." "Okay." Owen climbed up onto the counter the way he always did when they were in the kitchen together, sitting on the edge with his feet dangling. "Good or bad decision?" "I don't know yet." Owen nodded slowly, accepting this with the seriousness it deserved. "Is it going to mess things up?" Ronan stirred the pasta. Didn't answer immediately because Owen was the one person he refused to lie to, even by omission. "It might make things harder for a while," he said finally. "But I think it was right." And Owen looked at him for a moment and then said simply, "Okay." In that way, that meant he trusted the answer even if he didn't fully understand it yet. And he picked up his fork and tapped it against his knee, waiting for dinner, and Ronan realized that he was not going to be able to explain to this kid what he'd walked away from today. Not in numbers. Maybe not ever. But Owen had already decided it was okay, which was something else entirely. They ate reheated pasta with jarred sauce and nobody complained. And later, Owen spread his science fair materials across the kitchen table, tectonic plates made out of clay, a poster board that said "What happens?" underground in his very particular handwriting, half print and half cursive, and he talked for 20 minutes straight about subduction zones while Ronan sat across from him, listening, and tried to remember the last time he had just sat still and listened to his son talk about something that had nothing to do with metzges or funding or survival. By the time Owen was asleep, Ronan's phone had 23 unread messages from his administrative team, several from colleagues, and one from an unknown number that said only, "You've just ended your own career. Whitcomb doesn't forget." He read that last one twice, sat with it, then set the phone face down on the coffee table. Because this was what he hadn't been willing to say in the boardroom. The Whitcomb Medical Group didn't just acquire things. It absorbed them. It had done it 3 times in the last decade, taking independent surgical programs, promising research projects, things people had built out of actual care for actual patients, and folding them into the machine until they were unrecognizable. The outcomes looked fine on paper. The margins looked great on paper, but Ronan had watched what happened to the people inside those programs. He had talked to them at conferences. He had seen the look on their faces when they described what their work had become. He wasn't going to let that happen to what he'd spent 6 years building, but he also hadn't been prepared for how quickly the consequences would come. By Wednesday morning, 2 research partnership agreements that had been weeks from finalization had gone quiet. By Wednesday afternoon, a hospital network in the Pacific Northwest that had expressed serious interest in adopting his protocol sent a brief formal email citing a need to pause current negotiations. By Thursday morning, his CFO, a methodical woman named Paula Osei, who had been with the Institute since year 1, came to his office and closed the door. "Tell me what's happening," she said, Ronan told her. Paula didn't yell. She sat very still the way she did when she was running numbers in her head, and then she said quietly, "How many of these drop-offs are connected to Whitcomb? All of them, probably." She nodded once, slowly. "How long can we sustain at current rate?" 6 months. Maybe 8 if we defer some capital expenditures. She looked at him steadily. "Ronan, I've been here since the beginning. I believe in what we're doing. But I need to know you have a plan." "Give me 72 hours," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. 72 hours, she agreed, and stood up and walked back out. He watched her go and felt, for the first time, the full weight of the fact that this wasn't just his risk to carry. There were 41 people who worked for the Hale Surgical Institute. 41 people who had mortgages, kids, student loans, reasons to need their paychecks. And they had trusted him, not because he had promised them stability, but because they had believed in what he was building. That was its own kind of responsibility. The kind that didn't go away just because you'd made the principled choice. That night, Owen found him at his desk at 11 o'clock and stood in the doorway in his pajamas looking at him with that expression that was somehow simultaneously 9 years old and 40. "You should sleep," Owen said. "I know, you're thinking too loud. I can hear it from my room." Ronan leaned back in his chair. "Come here." Owen came over and looked at the screen, not understanding any of it. Schematics, data models, contact lists, an email chain that went back 3 years. Then he looked at his father. "Is this about the decision?" "Yeah?" Owen sat down on the edge of the desk. "The other people, the ones who were going to give you the money, they're making it hard now?" Ronan looked at him. "How do you know that?" Owen shrugged. "Because that's what happens when people don't get what they want." He said it like it was obvious, like this was basic information everyone possessed. "They try to make you regret it." Ronan was quiet for a second. "When did you get so smart?" "I've always been this smart," Owen said without any particular modesty. "You're just busy a lot." And Ronan laughed. Actually laughed, for the first time in 2 days, and it loosened something in his chest that had been locked tight since Tuesday morning. He reached over and put a hand on top of Owen's head, and Owen leaned into it slightly the way he'd done since he was small, and for a moment neither of them said anything. "I'm going to figure it out," Ronan said. "I know," Owen said. "You always do." And then he slid off the desk. "Don't stay up past midnight. It makes you sharp in a bad way." He went back to bed. Ronan sat there for another minute, and then he opened the oldest file on his computer, the one he almost never looked at, the one that contained the full documentation for something he'd spent 4 years building quietly in the background of everything else, something he hadn't been ready to show anyone, hadn't wanted to reveal until the conditions were exactly right. The conditions were now exactly right. What Ronan had developed wasn't just a pediatric emergency protocol. That was the part the Whitcomb Group had seen, the visible layer, the one that had made them come to him in the first place. But underneath it, woven through 4 years of patient outcome data and surgical decision analysis, was something no one else had built. An adaptive triage intelligence system. Not a product, not software, not the kind of thing you could simply purchase and deploy, but a methodology so deeply integrated with clinical judgment and real-time surgical data that it couldn't function without the expertise of the people who had built it. It couldn't be extracted. It couldn't be rebranded. It couldn't be handed to a new team and expected to perform. It could only exist where Ronan and his people were. He had never put it in a pitch deck, had never shown it to an investor or a partner group, had kept it protected, documented, and ready, because some part of him had always known that the day would come when he would need something that couldn't be taken. Over the next 72 hours, Ronan made 12 calls. None of them were to the Whitcomb Medical Group or anyone connected to it. 3 were to colleagues at research universities. 2 were to hospital system administrators he had known for years, people who had followed his work and asked, more than once, when they might be able to talk seriously. 1 was to a nonprofit medical foundation that had reached out 18 months ago and been told politely that the timing wasn't right. And several were to a small group of people whose names almost no one would recognize but whose institutional weight was enormous, the kind of figures who move through the world of healthcare infrastructure quietly and with considerable power. By Thursday night, things had begun to shift. Not loudly, not publicly, but the kind of shift you could feel in the temperature of conversations, in the slight change in tone of an email, in the way people who had gone quiet suddenly reappeared. By Friday morning, the formal invitation arrived from the Whitcomb Group, a request for a second meeting, and the language was almost identical to the first except for one difference, so subtle it would have been easy to miss, but Ronan caught it immediately. The word terms had been replaced with discussion. They weren't summoning him, they were asking. He went back to the 14th floor on Friday afternoon, but this time he didn't stand at the end of the table. He chose a seat in the middle, directly across from Catherine Whitcomb, and sat down before anyone invited him to. Nobody said anything about it. Gerald Whitcomb was already positioned at the head of the table, and his expression was more carefully neutral than it had been on Tuesday. He was a man who understood the value of a good poker face, but Ronan had spent 6 years working in trauma surgery, which meant he had spent 6 years reading people under pressure, and Gerald Whitcomb was behind the neutrality, recalibrating. "We appreciate you coming back," Gerald began. And even that coming back was different from the first meeting. On Tuesday, there had been no acknowledgement that Ronan had any choice in the matter. Ronan placed a slim folder on the table. Not thick, not designed to impress. Just 12 pages, organized clearly, summarizing what he'd spent the last year building and what it would require to access it. He slid it forward. "You came to me because you understood the surface value of what I've built," he said. "What you didn't know is that the most significant component of my work has never been made public. It can't be acquired because it's not separable from the people who built it. It doesn't exist without us." He watched the room, watched Catherine open the folder, watched her face change as she read, the careful professional neutrality giving way to something she couldn't quite suppress. Recognition, the particular expression of someone who suddenly understands they are looking at something they were not prepared for. Gerald leaned forward. "How long have you been developing this?" 4 years. A pause. "And you never disclosed this to us before the initial meeting." "No," Ronan said. "I didn't." Gerald studied him. "Why not?" And Ronan looked at him directly. "Because I wanted to know what kind of partner you'd be before you knew what you were really after." The silence in the room was different from the one on Tuesday. On Tuesday, the silence had been theirs, controlled, calculated. This one was uncertain. An uncertain silence in a room full of people accustomed to certainty was a very particular thing. Catherine set down the folder. When she spoke, her voice was still composed, but the quality of it had shifted slightly. Something had receded, some layer of dismissal that had been there before. "What you're describing would fundamentally change the terms of any arrangement," she said. "Yes," Ronan agreed. "It would," Gerald sat back. He looked at Ronan in a way that was different from Tuesday's assessment. Not warmer, exactly, but more careful. More genuinely attentive, the way people paid attention when they realized they had underestimated something. "What are you asking for?" And Ronan had thought about this moment many times in the last 72 hours. Had resisted the urge to over-engineer it, to come in with a list of demands designed to seem powerful, to play the game on their terms with better cards. Because that wasn't the point. The point was simpler and harder to argue with. "Autonomy," he said. "Full clinical and operational control over my institute and the work we do. A partnership, not an acquisition. Your capital and infrastructure are decision-making authority. No board override on patient care or protocol development. And equity, not a flat purchase price, because what we're talking about now isn't a transaction, it's a relationship." Catherine looked at her father. Gerald looked at Ronan. "You're asking us to share power," Gerald said. "I'm asking you to recognize that you don't have the power you thought you had in this room," Ronan replied. Not harshly, just with the particular clarity of a person who has nothing left to perform. "The work you want access to can only exist in partnership. That's not a negotiating position. It's just the truth." The room went very quiet again, and then Gerald Whitcomb did something Ronan hadn't expected. He smiled. A small, genuine smile, the first real expression Ronan had seen from him in 2 meetings. "You know what I told my daughter after you walked out of here on Tuesday?" Ronan waited. "I said, we missed something." Gerald looked at him steadily. "I don't like being wrong, but I respect when I am." Catherine closed the folder, looked at Ronan, and what was in her expression now wasn't the cool assessment of Tuesday morning. It was something closer to regard. "We'll need time to restructure the proposal," she said. "Based on what you've shown us today, a simple acquisition isn't the right vehicle." "You're describing a joint venture." "Yes," Ronan said. "That's what I'm describing. We'll need 2 weeks to draft revised terms." "Take 3, he said. "Get it right." He left the building at 4:47 p.m. on a Friday, and the city had that particular Friday afternoon feeling loosening, opening up slightly, the week's grip relaxing. He sat in his car for a few minutes before driving. Not because he didn't know where he was going, because he wanted to feel it for a second, the quiet, the specific kind of quiet that came after something had been resolved, but hadn't fully registered yet. Then he drove to pick up Owen from his after-school program, which he had made it to exactly 11 times in the last year, and which Owen had never once complained about him missing. And when Owen came out through the double doors and saw Ronan's car instead of the usual carpool, his face did something complicated and immediate that he tried to make look casual. But Ronan had known this kid for 9 years, and he knew what it looked like when Owen was happy and trying not to show how much. "You're early," Owen said, climbing in. "Yeah." Owen buckled his seatbelt, looked out the windshield. "Did it work out?" Ronan started the car. "Still in progress, but better." Owen nodded, satisfied with this. Then, after a moment, "Can we get tacos?" "Yeah," Ronan said. "We can get tacos." They went to the place on Meridian Street that they'd been going to since Owen was 6, the one with the paper trays and the salsa bar and the television in the corner, always on a soccer game nobody seemed to be watching. Owen ordered the same thing he always ordered. Ronan ordered coffee, which he'd been doing lately instead of eating real meals, and Owen looked at it and then looked at him, and Ronan added a chicken burrito to the order without being asked. They sat across from each other in the corner booth, and Owen told him about the science fair, about how his friend Marcus had built an entire model volcano, and everyone said it was impressive, but Owen pointed out, with his characteristic precision, that volcanoes were kind of the default science fair thing, and he was confident the tectonic plate subduction model was more intellectually honest. Ronan listened to all of this. He didn't look at his phone. He didn't run calculations in the background. He just sat across from his son in the taco place on Meridian Street and listened, and it struck him in the way that things only struck him when he was tired and the defenses were down, that this was what he had protected, not the institute, not the protocol, not the 4 years of data and methodology that had turned an entire room of powerful people into people who needed something from him. This exact thing. This kid across the table talking about volcanoes like it was the most important subject on Earth. This ordinary evening in a place with paper trays and bad lighting. This life that existed because he hadn't let anyone talk him out of who he was. Owen finished eating and then, in the way he sometimes did, turned unexpectedly serious. He put his elbows on the table and looked at his father. "The people who are being mean," he said, "are they going to keep being mean?" "Probably not," Ronan said. "We came to an understanding." Owen thought about this. "Did you have to be mean back?" "No, good," Owen said with some feeling. "That's not who we are." And Ronan looked at his son, at this 9-year-old kid who had grown up half in hospitals and half in quiet apartments and half in cars between one place and another, who had never had the stable, uncomplicated childhood that Ronan had always wanted to give him and had never quite managed, who had instead developed a particular kind of groundedness that couldn't be bought or scheduled or engineered. "No," Ronan said. "It's not." The weeks that followed were not easy. The revised terms went through 4 drafts. There were moments when Ronan wasn't certain it would hold, when the language would shift in ways that felt like old patterns trying to reassert themselves, and he'd push back quietly and wait. And each time Catherine Whitcomb's response came back slightly different from what he'd expected, slightly more willing to bend than he'd anticipated. And slowly, phrase by phrase, the document began to reflect something he could actually sign. His team started to breathe again. Paula sent him a single-line email when the 3rd draft came through. This might actually work, which from Paula was approximately equivalent to throwing a parade. The partnership went public 6 weeks after the 2nd meeting. Not with the kind of announcement that made front pages, but with the steady building recognition of people in Saffield who understood what it meant. Ronan Hale hadn't been absorbed. He'd negotiated from the floor and ended up at the table as an equal, with his name on the door and his hands on the work. And the Whitcomb group, for their part, had gotten something they hadn't known they were looking for. Access to a system that could not have existed without the man who built it, which meant that for the first time in their acquisition history, they had a genuine reason to keep someone like Ronan happy. It didn't make everything simple. It never did. There were still long nights, still budget conversations that tested his patience, still the constant low-grade tension of building something real inside a structure that had been designed for something else. But the work continued, the protocol expanded, and Ronan was still there, making the decisions in the room where they mattered. One evening, about 3 months after the partnership was finalized, Owen came and sat beside him on the couch while he was reviewing reports. He didn't say anything for a while, just sat there with his feet up on the coffee table, in the easy way of a kid who felt completely at home in his own life. Then he said, "Dad, yeah. You know how you said things might get harder for a while?" Ronan looked up from the screen. "Yeah, they did," Owen said thoughtfully, like he was completing a scientific observation. "But then they got different, and different is okay." Ronan set the tablet down. "Different is okay. Different is usually better," Owen said, with the confidence of someone who had decided this was simply true. And then he leaned his head against his father's arm, and Ronan let him, and they sat there in the quiet of the apartment, the city humming outside the window, the evening settling around them. And Ronan thought about the boardroom on the 14th floor, about the folder on the table and the number that was supposed to make everything irrelevant, about the moment he'd closed the document and felt the ground shift beneath him, about all the ways that moment could have gone differently, if he had been less tired, if the photo on his lock screen had been something else, if he hadn't spent 9 years learning, from a kid who couldn't even boil pasta correctly, what it actually meant to build something that mattered. He hadn't walked out of that room because he was brave. He'd walked out because some part of him had understood, in the particular clarity of an impossible moment, that there are things you can sell and things you cannot. And the difference between them isn't always obvious until someone puts a number on the table and asks you to choose. He had chosen. And sitting here in this apartment, with his son's head on his arm and the city outside and the work continuing and the life intact, he knew, with the quiet certainty of a man who had stopped needing to perform his own certainty for anyone, that he would make the same choice again. Not because it was easy, not because it had been without cost, but because some things only reveal their value when you refuse to let them go, and the most important ones were never for sale to begin with.